Hello, I'm Emma Jackson. I'm work in Glasgow in Scotland, and I'm here with my colleagues who are going to introduce themselves. And we are here to talk about we've named our session The Colour of Funding. Colour of Funding, Racialised Minorities in Scotland. So just a bit of housekeeping. I can hear people there. Maybe to make sure if you're not speaking that your phone your camera is on mute, and that we have the chat function which you can use. And I think what we're going to do is we're going to do our presentation there. And each of us will introduce themselves just at the front of who the team is. And then we are going to do the presentation, then open it up to some questions and explore some of the issues which we will discuss. So the main thing is that this is, it reports from research which we carried out under the Glasgow Common Cause Network in September 2018 to May 2019. And this was carried out by members of racialized communities who attended the network meeting. And it was delivered with Common Cause, Runnymede Trust, and it was in partnership with Glasgow Caledonian University. So before we go any further, I'm going to call out the colleagues on the team, and they can introduce themselves. Titi, you're to my left, so I'll just go with you.
Hi, I'm Titi Farukuoye. I'm based in Glasgow and do a lot of community work, anti-racist and kind of stuff. Tina, why don't you go next?
Hi, my name is Tina Yu. I work as a policy officer with Sense Scotland, and I joined the Common Cause Network involved with the project. And I'll go to Judy.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to our session. My name is Judy Wasige. I also attended the Glasgow Common Cause workshops and involved with young people in Glasgow through a project called IFA Project as well. Okay.
And Yvonne, over to you.
Awesome. Hi, my name is Yvonne, and I am also based in Glasgow. I attended the seminars also. I am a migrant rights campaigner and a social justice campaigner and a community development practitioner by profession. Back to you, Emma.
Okay, so thank you. So that's who the team is. And we're just going to talk through a bit about how the research, why it came about, how it came about, and then importantly, what it's found and what are the recommendations. And I think it will tune into many of the issues which are already being explored in this. And actually, we feel kind of fortunate that all that time ago that we were actually developing this small piece of research in order to try and highlight some of the issues which we were experiencing in Scotland. And really, they map very much onto the kind of ambition of this conference to do that. So we're really pleased as a team to have this opportunity to actually present our work here, because at that time it felt really just a bit tentative, I guess, in trying to explore it and to understand it, and to have a whole conference then that's engaged in it is great for us. So I think Titi, is it over to you now?
Yes, so racialization, the elephant in the room, and is it the reason funding may not work as it is intended? Afridi and Warrington suggest that tackling racialized inequality has been funded.
62 was
Helen, might you be able to mute yourself so we can hear me speak?
You've got to cut each board to fit in.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So Afridi and Warrington suggest that tackling racialized inequality has been funded in the UK since the 1960s. However, little has been done to understand how funding processes themselves are embedded in the same racialized systems which they seek to readdress. The urgency is also being called out by Dr. Adi Adlane and colleagues in response to the allocation of COVID-19 funding, which is a really current and recent example. Mahmoud and Dorothy also suggested researchers suggested the biggest factors holding back philanthropy's efforts to help advance social change are rooted in racialization. So that's kind of some of the background that we based our research on, or our thought processes on. And the Common Cause events were a series of events that was undertaken in over a 9-month period, and had 5 different action learning based sessions exploring a range of issues and featuring expert speakers, case study presentations, but also had this unique opportunity to step into the role of a funder themselves and decide how and why funding should be allocated and spent. The group was made of a broad spectrum of young people, older people, from a diverse range of people, ethnic backgrounds, professional and social backgrounds. And it's about 10 to 20 people who attended each session. The workshops were informed by Black feminist thought, and participants' views and opinions were consistently incorporated in workshop design, delivery, and evaluation. Participants expressed concern about funding processes throughout the seminar. So even though we were kind of coming together to look at the situation and support structures broadly for Scottish racialized communities, funding and finding ways to access funding and who allocated funding was this main theme that always came back to us and was really important to the entire group. And I guess how this infrastructure is complicit in sustaining that marginalization was really key in these conversations that were held. And thereby then, in consensus, in the end, the group decided to allocate that funding towards a research project where particularly that conversation or that question was going to be investigated, and to explore the experiences of racialized groups in engaging in funding processes and how the national support infrastructure works, and kind of starting to evidence these structures and starting to evidence what is happening there. And out of that group, a smaller group self-selected to design the interview questions, sought approval for ethic approval with the University of Glasgow Caledonian University, and then carried out the interviews, investigated further, and found communities and racialized people who wanted to speak on the topic. Tina, would you like to take us further into the rest of the methodology?
Yep. So the next slide. So with it, in terms of the project, there was a lot of anxiety about the research matter that we were kind of looking at, because we were looking at funding streams that were, and funding organisations that are held by a very select few that are funded by the Scottish Government. So in terms of taking part, and this is before Black Lives Matters and before we've kind of had dialogue talking about structural racism and all that, whereas now the landscape is quite different. So there was a lot of anxiety for ourselves as potential researchers, and also who we should interview as well. So we had a lot of thought put in, actually. So we looked at our peers. So I was one of the kind of interviewers, and I interviewed a couple of people that I knew with him. You didn't need any formal research skills, although I have kind of been involved in research, but maybe not so much as a researcher. So it was quite good for me to kind of learn those skills and downloading Audacity, and it even kind of brought back a fancy kind of transcription thing from work, although I didn't know how to work it. So I ended up just using what I had, my own tools, and finding the best way, and making kind of interviewees feel relaxed. But I felt a wee bit like a secret agent in a way, because when I was trying to kind of ask people, would you be interested in being interviewed, I couldn't tell them too much about it until they were definitely. So it felt like so until I was going to be interviewing them, I couldn't tell them much about the projects, and I felt a bit kind of covert a wee bit, and there was a bit of anxiety, but and it was fine. And so one aspect of ethical success was felt to be care had to be taken in design. So we did spend a lot of time about, the safety and the care, because we're thinking, well, if word got out that I was involved in it, would that impact on me accessing future funding from a funding organisation, or were we blacklisted because it's such? So it's on to the next slide, please. Thanks. And data analysis. So workshop participants and interviewers and interviewees each brought different knowledge. So myself, I've worked in within the Chinese community. I worked in health, mental health, and currently disability. So I knew a lot of people that worked across kind of equality kind of streams, and so thus myself were kind of viewed as participants as well. And data was collected from the 5 workshops and 5 conversational interviews. And the 5 key themes emerged from analysis of the data is that funding proposals framed as a response to racialization. Racialized labels may influence funding outcomes. Underrepresentation fosters exclusion, and applying for funding can feel like a compromise from the off. And community organisations feel pitted against each other for prime funding. And I feel as though I wish I discovered Zoom before I'd done the interviews, because it would have made it a lot easier. Because I remember trying to kind of, but then it was good to do face-to-face interviews. You know, it feels like a luxury now that we can't do it. But you know, I think kind of research is quite different. So I think, is it Judy that's the next part?
Yeah, thanks, Tina. I think it's quite, what was quite interesting was that I think all this interviewing almost walked into the pandemic as well, because we just almost finished and now this came up. And so kind of getting all the data together also became another issue that, you know, had to be done throughout the pandemic. So it was all a really strange process. Anyway, as Tina has mentioned, the 5 key themes, you know, that emerged from the data, including, first of all, the main one was that people felt that when they decided to, you know, go ahead and make project proposals, it was actually a response to the racialization and racism that they experienced. That the project ideas they came up with were not anything that was plucked from anywhere, but when they tried to kind of share the ideas with funders and with other organizations around them, they felt dismissed, and most of the time it's as though their ideas were not relevant at all, when actually they were the ideas that came from communities. And then secondly, because of that, it felt that, you know, they had to kind of adhere to the funding criteria, that what funders proposed was almost a prerequisite, that's what they wanted. They had to frame the ideas as in order to be heard. And so the other thing was that, you know, the funding environment is complex. Like they didn't, the data shows that people felt they couldn't understand where to get funding, whom to approach. And each time, you know, they went one direction, there were different rules for different funders. There were funding partners. Sometimes it was the funder themselves sometimes. So there was a lot of frustration that they would start one journey and then hit a brick wall because they weren't, you know, they just didn't understand. It was really, really complex. But then as we were going through this, people also realized that actually, you know, the longer you had been here, perhaps it became a little bit easier for you to understand, you know, the landscape. And then people started talking about support for communities, that there was actually, the Scottish government funded some organizations to actually support the BME, I'll call it BME just now, BME sector. And so this was really new to some of the participants, that, you know, there was support organizations. And I think this was a, you know, constant theme that came up. And some of the organizations that were named through that were BME, SEMVO, CREA, and then there were regional equality councils as well. And so people felt that actually then why don't we, you know, go further and explore what these organizations did. And that's how the interviewing process came up. And then another thing that, you know, was quite clear that came from the data, that springs out from the data, is that, you know, the funding environment is, you know, really, really strongly influenced by the, you know, government policy environment, that what the government kind of proposes somehow affects the whole system, you know, how funders respond to different communities and what the shape and volume of funding is. So the first thing to note was that the funding that organizations could apply for was kind of labeled. So, for example, you could apply for funding that was written BME or racialized communities or refugees and asylum seekers. Sorry, did somebody say something? You know, yeah, but and somehow those pots of funding was shaped by, you know, the labels on them. And then it seemed that funders, you know, perceived certain communities to be affected by some specific issues. So if you wanted to tackle a specific issue in your community that funders did not think affected your community, your chances of getting the funding were reduced. So one example of that was, for example, if you wanted to tackle racial forced or early marriage, then perhaps if you said that it was working with certain, you know, Asian communities, then your chances of getting that funding were increased. And then if you didn't do that, then your chances were reduced. And I remember there was a group that was talking about a research they carried out before to do with a policy gap. And when they used education as the focus, they didn't get funding. But when they tried using FGM, female genital mutilation, as the focus of the study, that the funding was given to them. So they were quite sure that, you know, the funding was only given to them because it was a culturally specific issue that they were talking about. So those issues that appear intimate and social harms are the ones that appear to be funded. But if you're speaking about broader transformational, you know, issues, then chances of getting funded are reduced. And then also another issue that came up was that, you know, it seemed that there were certain times when politicians and policymakers somehow realized that you existed. You know, for a long time, we don't seem to be seen. But when there were issues, like, for example, during elections, when you as a community might be used for their own advantage, or even like during this time of COVID, because COVID is affecting minority communities more than any other communities, you find that somehow these, you know, pots of funding coming through to your to those labels, like you'll get funding for BME, for refugees and asylum seekers, you know, much more seen than, you know, other funding areas. But however, the issue is that this kind of funding is so short-lived. It's small pots of money that are there just during that period, and after that, then, you know, there's the funding that comes to this sector is, you know, highly reduced. And then the other issue that came through when we were looking at the data was that most of the, you know, funding organizations are, you know, white-led, and there are very few people from, you know, BME communities that actually have decision-making roles within these organizations. And then because of that, I think it was seen that most of the time, because, you know, we kind of put forward proposals that we want to address the racialization, the racism, or the kind of disadvantage, discrimination that we face. On the other hand, you find that funders mostly actually are responding to racial equality. So those two things are quite different. And so you find there's a mismatch in the way the two are seen. And therefore you find that your applications, you know, will suffer to get funded, because your experiences somehow are not seen in the way that the funding criteria has been shaped. And because of that, then I think people were feeling that it's because of that there's this high volume of failed applications, that people, you know, write application after application, and that they never get funded. And that if you are newer communities, you know, in this area, it became really difficult for you to understand how the landscape worked, how people worked, the discourse, the terminology that was used, and therefore it became really, really difficult for you to make any breakthroughs. And this we have seen also in, you know, we did a piece of work to look at academic research as well. We found that most of the time, what people are addressing is actually the manifestation, or what the conditions people are living in. For example, you know, unemployment, underemployment, and so on, but very little is done to understand how these come to happen. And it's, that difference I was talking about, being racialized, and on the other hand, trying to tackle racial equality. So what the funders mostly try to do is look at, for example, why people are not being employed, or the other one we have here is why people have mental health issues, but they don't, look at the cause of why those things are there in the first place. Very few research that has been done actually looks at racialization and the cause of racialization and racism. And also at the same time, we can see, just as I said earlier, that because of the underrepresentation of people from minority communities in decision-making roles, it becomes very difficult to actually understand where they come from. So we can also see that in academic research, there's a higher, the higher proportion of people doing research in these areas may not understand, what it is to be racialized or to be racially discriminated against. And so because of all these things, people just felt that, it feels like you're already compromised before you even start applying for funding, that there are issues there. You're already seen as this as this group of people who possibly, are not effective enough, or, cannot do what you're proposing to do. So the only thing that people have to do, therefore, is probably conform to the dominant discourse, so that you get funding, and that, you cannot be creative in your own communities and come up and define your problems in your own way and come up with solutions that, are relevant to your communities. You just must use those, the criteria that has been shaped by funders. And this was quite evident because as part of the workshops, people brought their own ideas that they were trying to apply for funding. And it was thought that as a community, we might be able to speak, to support them in developing the ideas such that it could be funded. And you could see that, most of the ideas were actually trying to conform to, the dominant framing that is, that has been shaped by, policymakers and by the funding criteria. And then at the same time, those who had secured funding almost tried to, reinforce that kind of thinking. And then, of course, now what this is doing is that, we move away from actually looking at the problems in our own communities as they are, to kind of, bring in these forced solutions, which most times don't work. And possibly that's why, the solutions we try to propose may not work. But the other thing that came up really strongly was that once you got the funding, it became like, you had less time to actually focus on being creative to, solve the issues in your community. It was like there were so many reports you had to write, so many, the funding, obligations that you had to meet. And so that became like, more important than actually focusing on, delivering the work for communities. And obviously, I think, and what came through is that sometimes there seem to be some kind of tensions about, trust issues, whether, funders are thinking what you're doing is what you said you do, or whether you're doing whether you're actually doing it. Okay. And then another theme that came through as well was that, the shape of the funding in Scotland is such that there's prime funding for what they call the intermediary communities. And so everybody is somehow striving to get that kind of funding. So community organizations feel pitted against each other to compete for that funding. And what's happened actually is that it's ended up that funding has actually consistently remained in the same organizations. And as I've said earlier, is that once you get into that position of having the funding, then what happens is that you try to meet the funder obligations more than, looking at what the communities need. And this came through really, really strongly, that people felt that the intermediary organization somehow had lost contact with the grassroots. and that somehow they were, focused on just meeting, the Scottish government's obligations and everyone else and other funder obligations, but not what the communities really wanted. And, it felt that there was almost a group of people or organizations who kind of spoke to each other, who knew the language, who knew the landscape, and that's what they submitted and put forward, but that they were not speaking to people in the communities. And then another thing that came through then was that because most people do not know these organizations exist, it felt that there was some specific people, there was a select few people who this organization spoke to, either through mailing lists, and these mailing lists could have been designed in different formats. Some people were saying some of the organizations had a membership fee that had to be paid to join. But the issue is that if you are not on that mailing list, because these organizations are intermediaries, they get important information from the Scottish government, which they need to share with communities and community organizations. So if you are not on that mailing list, then you don't get that information. Secondly, these organizations also sometimes get funding which they distribute to community organizations. So if you're not on that mailing list, it means that you don't get that information at all. And so that confusion continues. And then at the same time, it seems that there's there doesn't seem to be any format of knowing how the BME voluntary sector in Scotland looks like. And I think there was an expectation from people that if these organizations are funded to support the BME sector in Scotland, then they should kind of have a transparent way of sharing information, a transparent way of showing people where to go, where to find information. For example, if you're new to Scotland, maybe they should be the go-to organizations where you can find out where you can get help or support, or just social a social group you can engage with. And then the other thing again was that despite the change in demographics in Scotland, it seemed that the leadership in this organization had remained constant all the time, and this was reflected in their boards and trustees as well. So another question we then asked ourselves was that, okay, if you are a community organization in Scotland, how do you know the shape of the funding? How do you access funding? Because people were frustrated that they tried so many things and it had proved almost impossible. So we then came up with this diagram here to just kind of show where people might go to get funding, or what the current structure might look like. So it appears we have the SCVO website, which kind of has keeps a tab of what funding is available and how people can access that. And if you don't know that, then you don't know and you won't be able to access it. But it's a good website where you can get all the information. And on that, you can, there's international funding, there's Scotland-wide funding, there's UK funding, there's local funders and local authorities as well. But then also you could see that, and this is common with, some organizations which do self fundraising, where you can, have specific events to raise money, or, use GoFundMe and so on. And then, we have, but what was quite critical about this is this central aspect here, where the Scottish government seems to have control of what everybody else here does, but that the intermediary organizations have a strong voice in saying, in kind of shaping what this landscape should look like. And because of this frustration, I think we also see that people are thinking about, optional ways of, organizing themselves. And I think because of the success of movements recently, people are thinking, is that a better option in which they can work? Or rather than, applying for funding where you're forced to meet funding criteria. And so that was one of the things that also came up. Okay, I'm now gonna move on to Yvonne. Next.
Thanks, Judy. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so the report went on to explore the reality of the complex nature of the racialized funding landscape. First, it explores how the landscape seems to have this one-size-fits-all model, and in doing so, it fails to grasp the racialized nature of that, with particular emphasis on anti-Blackness, and consequently it reinforces and perpetuates anti-Blackness. Another example, another thing that came through was the overly complex nature of the funding landscape, which results in government and intermediary organizations, as some of them that we just heard about previously, that Judy spoke about, either consciously or subconsciously colluding with the known unknowns. And there are several examples where funding are given in a sort of like trickle-down sort of trickle-down funding. So where you have intermediary organizations might give, say, £5,000 to an organization, or organizations that are on the front line. And this £5,000 is specific for support. However, this £5,000 will not extend, and obviously cannot extend, but the way the funding is limited, this amount of money, this small amount of money, is restricted to providing support, without taking into consideration that in order to provide support, the people who are providing the support need to be paid. So what this perpetuates is free labor. So you need an army of volunteers to do this free work. However, the people who are processing these funding applications, they are paid to process the funding application, while the people who are working, which are normally Black and brown people, it's like a slave economy. So that is one of the things that came out. Another thing came out about the intermediary organization and potentially the Scottish government also, is how the funding criteria. So most of the funding criteria for groups, that Black and brown groups that are on the front line, especially grassroots groups, the funding criteria may stipulate that you can only apply for a percentage of your previous year funding. And that might be limited to 10%. Now, if you're a grassroots group, or if you are Black and brown group where you're already excluded from funding and you're creative in probably maybe crowdfunding, and you might have small amount of money, say £10,000, 10% of that is £1,000. And to invest energy and time to write a funding application to the Scottish government or intermediary organization for you to get £1,000, which that there's no way that £1,000 is not effective even to support the projects that you're supporting, say if it's data top up or whatever basic thing it is, let alone paying the people on the ground to do that work. Can we move on to the next slide? So yes, thanks, Judy. In conclusion, what this study illustrates was how funding support and infrastructure and processes can maintain and perpetuate racialized inequalities. It emphasizes the role of societal structures and institutions in determining the conditions in which racialized communities are situated, and vulnerabilities and inadequate interventions that fail to recognize the structural dimension of these circumstances. Another thing that came out was compared with the level of need manifested in the needs of community, leaders and communities racialized throughout funding processes often show immense resilience in tackling overwhelming challenges they face with deficit funding and support. And before I go on to another point, there was another thing that came out of the funding, and Judy touched on that, how organizations seem to want to frame what the solution to the problem are. Apart from the trickle-down funding, there are organizations or intermediary organizations who they would fund for campaign. They wouldn't fund for campaigning to tackle systematic changes or long-term changes. However, they will fund you to raise awareness. Now, in Scotland, anti-racism work has been going on since like the 60s. And if it's constantly focused in raising awareness, I don't know how many awareness can be raised. And there seems to be a reluctance, and not just a reluctance, but there seems to be active, I can't find the word, but there seems to be a reluctance on the part of the funder to ensure that there's not systemic change is not being achieved. Because to specify that fundings are focused on awareness raising as opposed to political, as opposed to political campaigning or education that will focus on campaigning, then that in itself, for me, is perpetuating the structures. There we have a quote from a participant who we spoke to, and what the participant was saying, that it wasn't just one participant, it was several participants spoke about the feeling of despair and frustration and their experience in applying for funding, and they were at the point of not even applying for funding anymore to do racialized work because they felt like, and the quote is on the screen, it says, my work no longer focuses on anti-racist work. The government, public organization and funders often set large sums of money aside for anti-racist work, but there lack genuine goodwill for change. And what I would, as I said, Judy says most of it, and what came out was the frustration and especially how the lack of funding, and even with the pandemic and that the landscape has changed significantly, and there seems to be easier access to funding, and that is merely appearance, and I put this in quotation, they appear to be funding. However, as I said, these funding are limited to 10% of your previous budget. The funding is limited to £5,000 or £1,000. And even though Black and Brown communities experience the impact of COVID disproportionately, and Black and ethnic minority communities are the ones on the front line, they are the ones who are still unable to access these funding. I will now pass over back to Judy.
I think it's me coming in here now, Judy, is that right? Or no, is it
Yeah.
you, Judy? Can you change the slide? Yvonne, thank you very much for that. I think out of this research, the landscape has changed a lot since we started it. The hesitance or the tentativeness that we went into trying to explore this issue with the Runnymede back in 2018, some of the structural issues that we were trying to identify at that time have become clear globally. So I guess the recommendations that come that are recommendations towards this current understanding. And so we've strongly felt from it, from the analysis of what happened and from what people were saying, that funders should demonstrate their duty of care through showing they understand how racism creates the causes of social inequality before releasing funding, that they have a responsibility to demonstrate to communities, to people, how they have done the work to be able to release funding and are not perpetuating it. So that was a very strong feeling. Racism and racialization should be acknowledged as important mechanisms which lead to unequal outcomes. Racism is a cause within systemic inequality. Race equality is the desirable outcome, is a desirable outcome. Judy, next slide. I think there's 5 recommendations. Funders should have internal structures to support funding beneficiaries. And there's a risk that the intermediary funders their funding partners, distributing funding with little accountability of the vision and outcomes of the funding gives them power over the fragile communities who are differently racialized themselves. And so I think there was a feeling that if you're going to give funding, well then to fragile communities, then what have you put in place to support that? That again, it relates to the duty of care. An advisory board, it was suggested, and this links with other work that is going on in Scotland, because Scotland has a particular demographic which plays out across all these sorts of organizations because of the way demographic change has happened more over the last 20 years in particular, but before as well. An advisory board with scholars of racialization and expertise from communities racialized should be created with immediate effect to support funders understand when and how they perpetuate racialization through their own funding mechanisms. Funders need support, and we recognize that, to understand and to how racism functions and how different groups experience racialization differently. And so that we felt came out very strongly, and that the recommendation is for the funders to change their approaches to how they engage and to demonstrate their care for the people that they are intending to support. An interactive live depository should be created for funders to navigate and locate themselves, again, for them to do the work, not for communities to try to find that the communities can see where that funder is located, what their ambition for the fund that they are releasing actually sits, and so that then a community can see what other work they've funded. Are they an organization that they recognize others within it that they've already funded, and that this should be a live depository that people can then see, and communities can then decide whether that funder looks like someone that they would want to go towards. The depository, oh, sorry, just go back a bit, Judy. The depository will indicate publicly the resources and expertise, historical and current, because I mean, what happens in Scotland, as Yvonne was saying, is that it's repeatedly funding the same thing over and over to demonstrate the problem, not the solution. And that is a long-standing, well-recognized issue that happens, and it comes out of good intentions, but that really that has to stop, and that communities are able to create the solutions to what they see as the problems, and not having been positioned to re-demonstrate over and over again the problem. Next slide, Judy. The Scottish Government should review and update its discourse around surrounding racialization, change and shape the approach to intermediary funding organizations, and this should be set up more fluid and more rotational, and that should all be much more transparent, and include rural, urban, and avoids the duplication of services. Ensure accountability of the intermediary organizations. Evidence of the impact of their work across racialized communities must be widely shared with the diverse communities. Where policy work is the intended objective, exemplification of its implementation and impact should be disseminated to all stakeholders. I think, is that the last?
Yeah.
Yeah, so these are just some of the acronyms. So I think, Judy, if you put it back to, or either remove the slide and we'll just come back, and we just wondered if there was, so that's us finished, if there was any questions that people have of us at this point. I think we've just met our time. I think there's enough for a few minutes if anyone would like to ask any questions. I'm just going to see, is there in the chat or any hands up?
I think I saw Marcia Reed's hand up.
Marcia, that's nice. Ask your question, Marcia. Thank you.
No, I think my hand was up.
No.
Error?
Yeah, that's okay. So I think we're just, to be honest, we're nearly out of time. I just thought maybe if no one has any particular questions that they would like to ask, that I would just ask each of the participants to finish up with a final kind of word about having participated in it before we close the session.
Can you hear me, Emma?
Hello, sorry, Garvin, are you wanting to speak?
Yeah, I just wanted to say really quickly, so I'm in Scotland. I think one of the things that Black and Brown organizations need to think about is how they position themselves. So firstly, what is your elevator pitch? How is your organization a good investment? What sort of return on investment do you offer funders? Get on Twitter. Don't count on websites. The majority of funders put things out on Twitter well before it makes it to any website. There's things that are referred to as town hall meetings in the funding world, where they put out calls and they say, we're interested in a topic. Get yourself to those meetings so you can present your organization and talk about your expertise, what you have to offer. It's really important to join boards. I think you know from your own experience, look at universities. There are lots of academics who are researching these issues. How can you go in as partners and join in with their funding? Think about the intersectionalities of your organization. So are there women, minorities? What's your duration of running? What's your geographical area? What's your specific focus? All of these things are specific ways in which you can look for funding, so you're not just thinking, we're a Brown organization, we want to deal with Brown issues, who's out there. There's way more out there than I think the tunnel vision approach that traditionally happens in organizations with which people find themselves, end up in. And also get yourself a professional grant writer. Get someone who has done this, who's won from various sources, so that you can then win the money and not spend a lot of time dejected and focusing on all the problems when there are so many solutions that are currently out there.
Okay, thank you for that, Gavin. I think I think this is perhaps not necessarily the place now at the time, but I think actually I would possibly agree opposite to what exactly that you're saying, that actually I feel that community, that's exactly the issue of how communities have been strained and stretched and pushed and pulled to actually try and engage with a system that does not recognize their ways of engagement. And it is in fact, actually, we would argue for the opposite, that actually it is for the funders to have a duty of care to understand how much pressure communities and people who are racialized actually experience within the system, and for them to therefore change their processes and not to stretch the communities even further to engage with a system which systematically and systemically is not meeting their need. So I would agree that
You muted yourself there,
Sorry, Michelle, sorry, I see your hand is up, Michelle.
Yes, Michelle Charters from Liverpool, Cumbernauld Millennium Centre. I wanted to ask, because it's the first time I'm really hearing about the Black experience in Scotland, and what I wanted to ask was, is there a Black network of activists and organisations that are looking at how to tackle all of these issues of exclusion?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if one of the others want to answer. We do have organizations which are historically there to support that, but there has been real, I think some of the frustration of this research came out of people's experience of those organizations that are there ostensibly to kind of create those networks. So I think that it was, so there are definitely organizations there, how they function is changing a lot just because of the democratizing of information and ways to contact, and so there is more fluidity around this, and I think, but the research itself actually came out of some of the frustration because of the relationships that seem to be or because of the way some of the intermediary organizations were actually functioning, and those particularly the big, like the Voluntary Action Fund, the impact funding, some of the huge funders within Scotland who then had not demonstrated to communities that they necessarily understood how racism and racialization functions in Scotland and yet they were determining how the funding is spent. So I don't know if any of the others wanted to.
Yeah, I think it's similar in terms of in sort of mainstream in the voluntary sector, because the funding is so tied in. So it's almost like the moment you've got funding, you kind of lose. So if you were an organization that was maybe an activist and grassroots level, but then the moment you've kind of received this ongoing funding, it's, although they don't say that you can't do this, there's an invisible kind of saying, well, if you do that, well, guess what? You're going to get any more funding. So it's like that, your door is shut. So, and then, which is no surprise in terms of, you look at a lot of even my own organisation, I work for a disability charity, they get really worried because they receive Scottish Government funding, my post included. So they get worried about, doing things and it's to toe the line really. And I think and as a Black organisation, even more so difficult because funding is just so limited. And then when you have other BME, like so-called infrastructure organizations, and there are the gatekeepers in a way, so that makes that pool even smaller. So you're not just got the actual racism of the subject matter already, you have that mechanism, there's racism, and then you have within that everybody's just trying to get a slice of the pie, and then so you either decide, shall I join them, shall I just kind of do what, or do you do your own thing? And that's very difficult,
And thank you for that, Tina. I am very aware of the time. Yvonne, Titi, Judy, have you any other last points that you would like to highlight before we close? Yvonne?
Not necessarily, except that I think...
Speak just a bit closer, Yvonne, thank you.
Yes, no. I think you've already highlighted what in relation to how sometimes it's not what it seems, what appears, what it seems, but it's what it is in reality. So even though all these things, that the gentleman said that these are the things that we should be doing, these are the things, as we mentioned, that this anti-racism, struggle in Scotland, it's not something that emerged yesterday. We didn't emerge out of Black Lives Matter. We preceded Black Lives Matter. So we have information, we have knowledge, we have organic information, we have information of people who have gone before us. So this is something that we have been dealing with since probably the past 40 years.
Titi, have you any?
Yeah, I guess just to re-emphasize again, because of the intermediary organizations that are kind of the gateways to that funding, and because them being so traditionally embedded within a structure, they kind of perpetuate and reinforce the racist systematic structures that already exist, and thereby it's really hard for them, and that's the main critique, or one of the main critiques that we're offering, that it's really hard for them to not continue and perpetuate that racism that the communities experience. And that there is a lot of research that the most marginal groups within marginal groups are always the ones that are not going to receive the funding. And that's just something that we see here. And because of the demographic representation that exists in Scotland, there are particular groups that are continuously not going to see that funding, and where that slice of the pie has become so thin that it's not going to have anything left over for these specific groups.
Thank you, Titi. Judy, have you any final comment?
Yeah, I think that the biggest thing that's happened over these periods of time is that, lack of kind of acknowledging that we have an experience, like our experiences are somehow suppressed, and our skills somehow do not matter. And I think that's the biggest issue that's come out, that funders need to start listening, start hearing and seeing that what we propose is actually probably what's been the missing link, that funding has been given for so many years and the goodwill is there. So much money has been given out, but just because the voices that lead on this kind of who is funded, who's leading the research, who's leading the community organizations and the ideas, I think that's where the issue is. And so please, it's a matter of listen and start working with the communities to actually make a change.
Okay. Thank you for that, and thank you for coming to our session. I think the take home really from me is that in this moment of rethinking of the clear indication across the world of the way that COVID impact on the inequalities and the racialization that happens within that is for funders and those who are seeking to support the issue, reflect on that issue at this time and engage. And I think that really is what the report, which came out way before this, or the work that had happened way before this, and the tentativeness of that went into, which has been kind of exploded by the way that we've understood how racism functions in our systems, and that's why I say that we switch it. We want to see it switching round, that they show the duty of care if they're going to give funding, and these are the structures that we need around in order to proceed with the work. So thank you for coming, and we will. It is going to be written up into the report, and thank you to Runnymede for supporting the communities in Glasgow way back in 2018 when we started, and from what this research came from. So thank you very much. Bye.